All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with the final panel of the day. So thank you so much to Dr. Shelley and TraCCC for putting this wonderful day together. It's been incredibly informative. My name's Paul Massaro. I asked the question earlier, and actually one of my colleagues just asked a question in the back, so that's wonderful. You guys got to know the U.S. Helsinki Commission real well today. We're this quasi-committee on the Hill led by 9 senators and 9 representatives, and we've been paying very close attention to all sorts of interference, including judicial interference. And I think that that's kind of the way I want to frame this discussion on solutions and recommendations, is to say, you know, this is one aspect of a larger trend that we're seeing: financial interference, abuse of the financial system, judicial interference, abuse of the judicial system, and so on and so forth. This is, you know, a piece of a much larger new kind of foreign policy paradigm that we're moving toward, and that is to see the world, to see the globalized world as kind of a competition now between 2 normative systems, one based on democracy, the rule of law that includes civil society and journalists and free media and so forth, and the other based on corruption, authoritarianism, transnational organized crime. And unlike, you know, during the Cold War when we had 2 hermetically sealed systems, these 2 interlock, and that's what we're dealing with every single day. So I want to echo some of what Ben said in the previous discussion. I thought that was really great. I think that's the direction we're headed toward, but I'm really looking forward to hearing other points of view, or hearing those reinforced by our panelists today, all of whom, with the exception of, again, Bruno, you know, seem to be the odd man out. I know pretty well. So that's great. I think the one last thing I'd like to say, you know, as we think about, you know, I've heard it brought up many times. We want Congress thinking about this. We want Congress saying stuff about this. We want to educate Congress. I think it's very important. I think we should also think about how we want our political branches of government to speak to the judiciary, given that judicial independence is a very central piece of all this. It's fundamental to the rule of law system. And if we have the political branches speaking too much or too often or too vitriolically to the judiciary, then we obviously put ourselves in a bit of a trap where we're undermining our own system. So with that, I'll hand it off to Charles. So please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Is this working? All right. Well, I would also like to echo what Ben Emerson said. And he said, I mean, my notes that I made sort of echo his, although he wasn't euphemistic. He was very clear. Mine are even less euphemistic and brutal, but I think he really summarized beautifully and with his marvelous accent the direction we need to go in. I mean, very simply, it just seems to me absurd that we're in this Interpol system with authoritarian kleptocratic regimes. I mean, and that we saw Russia was talked about a lot, but China has turned into this Orwellian dystopian dictatorship, and for us to be sharing some sort of system of justice with a regime like that also seems completely absurd to me. And so, I mean, one obvious thing, and this has been proposed, is that the free democracies withdraw from the system and create their own system, which seems to me to make a lot of sense. So we have that, and then we find some way, perhaps, of interfacing with the other regimes that are problematic and that do not share rule of law to begin with, and that have no interest in liberty. And maybe in some cases we can interact with them. And I open a parenthesis because I had the great honor of hosting the Spanish prosecutor, Jose Grinda Gonzalez, last May, June. And he was talking to us about how he actually interacts a lot with the Russian law enforcement and what he's doing in Spain. Some of you may have heard about what he does. I mean, he's part of a group of Spanish prosecutors, and he's the best known, the star of it, who are trying to kick Russian organized crime out of Spain. They're not trying to save the world. They're just trying to get these jerks out of Spain. And we were very befuddled as to why he is interacting so much with Russian law enforcement. And finally, I've thought about this, and it occurred to me maybe the Russians had forgotten this old mafia saying, "Never let a man know what you're thinking." So he knows he's not really going to get anything he can use in terms of normal collaboration between law enforcement agencies, but maybe he's getting a negation that he can use. He's getting more than nothing. And that's all I could figure out as to why he would do that. So maybe it's in that sort of a bizarre zone where we could have our own system and then be clever and not the sort of naive schmucks we are now about these things, and interact with these authoritarian regimes that are kleptocratic or Orwellian dystopian dictatorships. So I'd say that's one way to go. One thing that was a little, which is distressing, was when Bruce Mizamore was talking about how when he's dealing with these adversary, and I say adversary from a rule of law standpoint, adversary countries of ours, well, he's in touch with Cleary, Gottlieb, Baker, Botts, et cetera. So I think that we need in the West to really reform our enabling industry for these kleptocratic countries, and we've got to find some way of self-policing, of getting the pillory back on the green in terms of our supposedly most prestigious law firms representing what Bill Browder calls the bad guys. Of course, everything's very easy with Bill. They're the bad guys and the good guys. If it's late in the day and you're kind of tired, one just turns to these simple constructs of Bill Browder's, it makes things a lot easier. Otherwise, part of this also, it seems to me, is a very important point is this involves sovereignty. When we're trying to interact in this red notice stuff and all of that, we're giving up a lot of sovereignty, and I think this is a notion that is very important and that we're neglecting right now, and that was mentioned. And just last point, if we look at a lot of this discussion, what struck me was, first of all, our naivete in participating in this the way we are. And that just seems to me ridiculous. But also, we look at the red notices, but also the other aspects of how our judicial system is being used by bad actors. And there's an extraordinary porosity of ours. There are all these little places you can sort of go in. And I think we really need our best minds to think about that and shut down a lot of those little cracks. I mean, it's sort of like fixing a roof. Right now, my roof in DC has extreme porosity. I think we have leaks in 3 places. So I don't know how to fix it. So we need our roofers who have had a great deal of international experience with these matters to plug some of the holes. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much, Charles. And yeah, I think the roofers in Congress are very busy right now with all sorts of things. You know, I really hope that in the coming Congress we'll be focused on a lot of these things to really patch those holes in the legal and financial framework. I also wanted to emphasize once again this point of engaging less with authoritarian regimes. I think we've talked a lot today about comedy. Comedy is very important, but it does not necessarily mean that you need to invite everybody into your clubhouse. And bringing everybody into the international organizations and that espouse liberal values is not necessary in order to achieve or enjoy or respect comedy. And I think that the word that I keep hearing in the circles that we run in around here is this word disentanglement. The idea that we could disentangle with authoritarian regimes in various ways. So I'd love to hear any more on that, both in support of or in opposition to. So with that, Bruno, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to find myself on the defensive, as you initially suggested. And in all honesty, I think I've said everything I needed to say in my first presentation. But I would just like to start off again by stating my opposition to this idea of suspending countries for being authoritarian members of Interpol. And the idea of forming an alternative police cooperation organization just for democratic states. The first thing that I wanted to address is this kind of perception that Interpol is completely hollowed out in terms of its legitimacy and its ability to function. There are some very, very serious problems with Interpol which need to be fixed, but it ticks along just fine. Interpol is, as was discussed initially this morning, a relatively boring organization that helps to facilitate information between police forces, which, the vast majority of time are pretty boring information about fraudsters and burglars, not necessarily about political dissidents. Those cases we accept and agree amount to a relatively small proportion of what's going on. It's not to say that that's okay. Obviously, even one example of an individual being arrested for political motivated grounds is a problem that needs to be addressed. But it's not right for us to be exaggerating that problem, is to suggest that the organization has completely lost its legitimacy. The second point that I wanted to raise was something that I mentioned already, which was the need for a global policing organization to be global in order to function properly. And that was a point, I think, that was made much more eloquently by Ben Witt earlier today. I couldn't possibly say it much better myself. And then the third thing I wanted to address was this kind of, the question of fracturing police cooperation into kind of one set of democratic states and leaving the rest to, something else, and kind of leaving like a kind of residual kind of police cooperation system in place. The fact of the matter is that Interpol is that residual system that exists. Being British, one of the biggest things that's on my mind at the moment is Brexit. And just the other week, a colleague of mine went to a conference about Britain's cooperation with the European Union on criminal justice matters after March of next year, essentially. And one of the things that was talked about was, well, what's going to happen if we leave without a deal in terms of criminal justice cooperation? And the response from some of the European Union representatives was, well, we would just have to rely on Interpol. And that's what Interpol is. There are lots of other mechanisms in place already that facilitate police cooperation between like-minded states, especially in the European Union, and Interpol is that baseline. But having said that, there are risks in relation to developing a multiple system of police cooperation arrangements. And the best example, I think, can be found in the European Union itself. The European Union has gone one step further than the concept of comity and the sharing of information, where we have a system of mutual recognition on the basis not only that there's an assumption that European Union countries are not only rule of law respecting countries, but also they adhere to basic human rights standards. The operation of mutual recognition instruments in the European Union, including the European arrest warrant and various other similar type of instruments, have shown that actually this kind of trust that exists between like-minded states, supposedly, simply doesn't exist. And that throws in to play a whole lot of different issues. And the response of the European Union has been to have had no choice but to legislate on various human rights protections which are binding across the European Union in order to reinforce those mutual recognition instruments. And the other problem is the likelihood of this kind of suspension occurring at Interpol. We shouldn't kid ourselves into thinking that this idea of more checks and asking questions is particularly popular with Interpol member states. It's annoying for them. It's meant to be a system that's meant to facilitate international police cooperation. And for that reason, it won't just be a question of the abusers having issues with countries being kicked out. It'll be, I would imagine that the opposition will be far greater than that. And the other thing that I wanted to say was just because a country like Russia gets kicked out of an organization like Interpol, it doesn't necessarily put an end to the problems that we're talking about. The side effects of something like that happening could be far uglier, as we've seen in the Turkish example. Countries may resort to much more clandestine, more dangerous ways of achieving the same aims. So the solution that we're proposing at Fair Trials is caution, caution from member states and caution at Interpol as well. Red notices, as we discussed earlier on, they're not arrest warrants. They do not have any legal value of their own. And countries, it's up to countries themselves to decide what on earth to do with an Interpol red notice when they see it. So there is a very simple solution that countries should be better aware of what an Interpol red notice even is, as one way of addressing the problems. And I'm not going to go into all these details about what kind of problems that Interpol itself needs to fix. That's already been discussed. And if you've had a look at our 2018 report, they will all be there. Thank you.
Well, thanks again very much, Bruno. Very helpful. Let's go ahead and move on to Dr. Shelley.
Right. It's a pleasure that so many of you are still here at the end of this day. There were a few things that I thought needed to be covered more, and I hope those who take on this issue will go farther with it. But we focused mostly in our discussions on authoritarian states, on the misuse in the post-Soviet states, Turkey, China. But there's this problem of misuse of red notices and of Interpol is broader than that. And there are problems emanating out of Latin America, not just Venezuela. There are problems out of African states. Last week there was an article about two Canadian women who were targeted as a result of their relationship with an oligarch in Nigeria. And so we're looking at a problem that is more global, and as one expert on Interpol from the last administration said, it used to be a problem of smaller countries, and now it is bigger and more powerful countries that are using this, and that's a very dangerous tendency. But one of my concerns is what is going on in the US at the moment. And sort of what started and galvanized me to pull this together was last spring I was in an Atlanta courtroom of the Immigration Court. And like Mr. Ismail, who talked this morning, he had a success in Atlanta. I saw something that reminded me of sitting in Soviet courtrooms as I did in the 1970s. And I was called down to testify in the case of a Kalmyk who had been arrested and detained on a red notice. Now, for those of you who haven't followed Kalmykia, it is an obscure Buddhist region in southern Russia where the former head of Kalmykia, who still calls the tune there, has been designated in 2015 by the US Treasury as a supporter of terrorism and of Syrian activity. So here we have a man who's sitting in detention now for protesting against a leader that we have identified as an enemy of the US government. So what do we have? We've got a problem, and not only did the documents go through Interpol, but we do not have enough review within DHS of what the problems are with red notices. And with the problem of the increase in volume, this is a resource allocation. And when we accept documents, we are taking individuals who are courageous, who are brave, who are opposing people that we have chosen to designate. And then I was sitting in this courtroom hearing from the prosecutor that the Russian justice system has improved in its quality in the last 6 years. And also, as a decision was made subsequently by the judge, that Russia does not target small-scale dissidents. All blatantly false. So this is an undermining of the quality of our justice system under this administration in a case that would not have happened previously, where you did not have people who are law-abiding, who've been living in this country, applying for asylum, being held in detention. And with me was, since this person who was being held didn't have much money, I was staying with a college friend of mine who's now an eminent professor who started out life in communist Yugoslavia. And sitting in this procedure, watching what I was going through, it was all too reminiscent of his childhood. So this is a problem of how red notices and their abuse are undermining the quality of our justice system at the moment. Another area in which this is a serious problem that was brought up very briefly, but nobody has followed up on it, was the comment by Mr. Jeffroy of the National Security Institute, who talked about and mentioned very briefly the problem of discovery in US courts. But this is a much more important issue than his slight reference to this, because we have Russians primarily, but others, using the process of discovery to collect financial information on their political and economic competitors. And this is something that deserves much more attention because our courts are naive and we are not been sophisticated enough in understanding how people misuse our justice system. It was mentioned also by Mr. Jeffroy, the excellent report prepared by Anders Aslund, who initially wanted to be with us today and basically couldn't, but he refers to this in several of the cases that he looked at, or at least one of the cases he looked at in his report released by the Atlantic Council. The third area that I wanted to say that deserves more attention and is incredibly complex is that of cybercrime. And this is an increasing problem for the US, as Suzanne Spalding talked about, as Mr. Chertoff talked about, and as some people in our audience who've worked on these cases know about. The problem comes, as I have written about in my book, my recent book, Dark Commerce, is the duality of the criminals involved in this, just as Mr. Chertoff said, who are analogous in some ways to the pirates of the 1600s, who would be pirates for themselves at some point, but then, like Sir Francis Drake, were pirates for the interests of the state. And now we're dealing with cyber pirates, who are at some point making money for themselves, but then get offers they can't refuse and become cyber pirates for the Russian state and sometimes other states. And therefore, we are going to be looking at very, very complex issues of how we deal with international requests on cyber criminality when at some point we're dealing with a criminal and some point we're dealing with an actor who's acting on the behalf of a state. And we have not gotten to a way to process and analyze this increasing tendency that has major national and global security implications for us. So this is not just a problem of cooperation on transnational crime, but of transnational threats that undermine individuals' security and national and global security. So I want us to be thinking more broadly about this. And as we engage with multinational institutions, we need to be thinking about where the trends are going in transnational crime and what the implications are for our legal institutions, because the rule of law is absolutely central to democracy. And if our rule of law is undermined and abused, this undermines and abuses our democracy. Thank you.
I almost want to clap for that, Dr. Shelley. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. And let me also highlight you bringing up the abuse or the It's the guy that kept correcting himself today, the manipulation, I think it was Ben Witt, of the discovery process. I'm really happy you brought that back up. This is an issue that has come through the doors of the Commission on a number of occasions. People that have been victims of authoritarian regimes, both in the Raiderstva Russian cases. I think the most recent that I can remember is the case of Sergei Leontiev, the former owner of the Pro-Business Bank. And there's just so many of these where we see this happening in our system. And again, this is something that I think deserves a little bit more study and scrutiny as we keep thinking about these issues. Now, I'll ask one question. I see we're already short on time. And Charles, I saw you also wanted to say something, so feel free to ignore my question and say what you wanted to say too. But that is, as a staffer working for Congress, we talked a lot today about educating members. We talked a lot today about the congressional role, and yet I heard very little about, with the one exception of, I think it was 1704, about what Congress can actually do in a legal way. What in the U.S. Code can really be changed from a legislation perspective to address this issue. So that would be my grand question, and hopefully we can take one from the audience and close it out. But Charles, I want to let you go. You had a rebuttal or response or something there.
No, well, let me try. The grand question is very important, and I'm not sure what the answer is. I think it's probably, the answer will be granular. Again, I think it's going to be plugging a lot of loopholes and things. And there was an anti-money laundering bill where I testified to the Senate Judiciary Committee, I guess it was. And it was basically 12 or 14 different measures that were all just sort of updating things vis-a-vis technology and changes. And I think we're going to have to be in a constant mode of when we'll have a bill, we'll need to update it all the time because this is a moving target and new techniques are embraced all the time by our enemies. But I'll just make very quickly on one aspect of the porosity that we have. I think one huge gaping hole is this notion that everyone is entitled to representation. So we have all these bad actors from authoritarian kleptocracies who, lots of kleptocrats who can hire very high-priced representation here in Washington and the United States. And this gets really egregious if on top of that they are wanted by US law enforcement. And we have examples, and I can't resist mentioning, because in the previous panel, there was a very high ex-US government official who was representing a wanted man who we have been trying to extradite from some other country. I will leave it as euphemistically as that. And that's just profoundly messed up. But we're allowing that, and we're sitting here today with that having been in our midst. That's something that we need to correct. No, that person isn't necessarily entitled, if they're wanted by US law enforcement, to any representation here, it seems to me. And that's obviously going to shock certain people. We're going to have to make choices to defend our liberty. In this case, the circumstances are particularly egregious and shocking. They have shocked everyone whom I have brought this to their attention, and this is the kind of thing that we're going to have to oppose and at the very least get the pillory back on the green.
Bruno, do you have anything to say to the idea that not everyone deserves representation? I feel like he might. So let me see if he does.
I thought you were going to ask me a question about what the U.S. Congress can do.
Oh, sorry, Bruno.
I'm literally the worst person to be answering
working
that
for an
question.
organization called Fair Trials and all.
No, I think I did have an answer to that question, which was basically exactly the same thing that I said earlier on, which is to do with funding. The organization, Interpol as an organization is extremely underfunded, and particularly those institutions that help to keep help to protect the institution are really, really lacking in funding, and in some cases they're getting less funding than they used to. So that was the only thing that I was going to push. In all honesty, I don't think I have a good opinion to share in relation to whether every country deserves representation in international organizations. Frankly, it's not really my field of expertise. There is, however, some discussion in any event about Interpol as its status as an international organization in the first place, but it's not something that I want to go into.
Okie doke. Dr. Shelley, anything to either of those points?
No.
Nothing about Congress, really?
I think that Congress, I think that Congress in its oversight function needs to be paying much more attention to what DHS is doing in vetting red notices and other international agreements, that we're not resourcing this enough. And also in our Judiciary Committee, we're not working on trying to educate our judiciary on these new risks. I mean, we do fund a federal judicial center, we fund training programs, but we're not aware of these kinds of what I would call new threats. And we're still dealing with the old problems and not the new challenges that come from transnational crime. So it's not always necessarily a legislative process, but it's part of the role that Congress plays in oversight, in how some of our agencies need to operate, and what needs to be brought up as we increase awareness and response to transnational crime. Because, as I said in my media blitzes last week on Interpol, that Interpol plays an important role in getting counterfeit pharmaceuticals out of markets in Africa. It helps coordinate operations against wildlife. It helps work on cybercrime. So it does many things that are needed, but it's also a postal box that isn't provided, it's serving more as a postal box than an analytical support for the abuses that come from many people, increasing the amount of requests that are coming through that cannot be properly processed. And as I was saying in my questions this morning, we're also not only not vetting enough of this, but we're not aware of what problems to look for as countries prepare better documentation. And that's where congressional oversight needs to come, in raising awareness and demanding that our agencies be more responsive to these new challenges that we face.
Great, thanks. We're just a little bit over time, but I'd really like to get one or two questions in one round. Right there. Anybody else want to ask a question? Right there. Okay. So let's just get both questions, and then we'll answer and we'll call it quits.
Right.
Thanks. I just want to push back on Bruno a little bit, sorry. And also want to push back a little bit on Charles also to make it fair. So Bruno, in defense of the proposition that that we should be taking measured steps to be cautious with Interpol rather than do something dramatic like any of the suggestions we've heard today. You've said that, well, Interpol red notices aren't arrest warrants, they're just notices, and that's that. They have no legal power in and of themselves. But what I seem to have gathered today is that these authoritarian regimes aren't necessarily they're very good at using mechanisms that are on their face somewhat benign, but they use them for the purposes of their effects, which really are, that is to say, they're effective harassment tools. And the red notice is an effective harassment tool. You don't need to have the red notice is an effective harassment tool. So it doesn't need to be an arrest warrant or have the same force and effect as an arrest warrant in order to be, for its abuse to have very real effects. And very often, as in the case as in many cases, they're part of a larger harassment campaign. So that doesn't really cut in your favor. How do you respond to that? And because your response doesn't get at the harassment aspect of it. And for Charles, what about the negative effects of the withdrawal of, let's say, the United States from Interpol, or booting out an authoritarian regime from Interpol? What about those potential negatives that Bruno mentioned in his in his part?
Okay, great. If you could think about that for a second, Charles and Bruno, we'll take one more question.
I was just wondering whether Europol has done any evaluative work about the operation of Interpol.
Bruno, do you think you might be able to speak to that?
About Europe?
About that question? I'm not sure if we have like the expertise up here as well.
I do know something.
Okay. So let's go ahead and do the first question first. We'll do the second question second. Charles, Bruno, and then we'll throw it to Dr. Shelley. How about? So Bruno, Charles, actually. Yeah, thank you.
You're totally right about the point about the harassment. Actually, a lot of the countries that are using the red notices against dissidents know very well that they have no chance of actually getting anyone, getting those people sent back to whichever country it is. Quite often, it is a defamatory tool. So if if there's a photo of you on Interpol, if you Google your name and the first thing that comes up is an entry on Interpol's website with your horrible-looking face and red notice, that in itself is an extremely serious problem. The point that I was trying to make, though, is that there needs to be just better awareness and better caution in relation to what an Interpol red notice is. And that's not just in relation to what kind of legal value it is, but also being better aware of what actually Interpol is and what red notices are, how they get issued. Then we are in a better position to understand that this is actually quite a vulnerable mechanism. And it enables us to respond better to the challenges that we're talking about.
Great, thanks. Charles.
Well, that question, we almost had a Russian elected head of Interpol recently. So if that had happened, I'm not sure you'd be asking the question, or at least things might be colored a little differently.
Yeah, okay. Dr. Shelley.
On the question of Europol, Europol isn't studying Interpol, but there are people who switch between these multilateral law enforcement organizations. So I'll say that there is awareness that there's an increasing problem in Interpol, expressed to me by a very senior person at Europol.
All right, well, that's all the time we got, so we'll close down the final panel. I think we still got some closing remarks from Dr. Shelley, but thank you, everybody. Bruno, thanks for being a good sport.
I have no formal closing remarks other than to express my thanks to the Schar School, to the TraCCC community, to the National Security Institute of the Law School that all facilitated this, and to all the speakers and others who've been such a good audience. The one thing I want to say is that TraCCC is a very small organization and can do a few things well, like put on a good conference today. Or I think it was a good conference thanks to all of you as wonderful speakers and a wonderful audience. But I think the issues that have been raised today are extremely important and need to be carried out and carried forth by many people. We have not been hearing enough from the American Bar Association. We've not been having enough hearings on the Hill of these new challenges that transnational crime and the potentials for abuse that come with cooperation in this issue bring to us. And so I'm putting this out to some of you to keep up and expand this discussion. We'll be happy to come back and visit it in the future, but what often happens with us is we throw ideas out and we hope that others will bring them up and follow from them, because we can't do everything. But we really want to be, and feel we have been today, a place for discussion, for intellectual exchange, and this neutral space that a university provides to bring up a very important problem or a series of important problems and think about where we need to go from here to address them. And so this has been a collective effort of us and you, and I want to thank you all who have donated your time, who've spent your enormous effort, who've traveled distances to be with us, and thank you all enormously. Our visitors have come from England, from around the United States, from great distances to help present this discussion, and we want to thank you from the depths of our heart and our commitment to the rule of law. So thank you.